All right. It's 3 o'clock, so we can get our session going. My name is Taylor Beswick, city planner with the city of Bettendorf, Iowa. Today, hosting and speaking with us about electronic vehicles in Iowa is Deborah Arp. She is the grant program administration. She's the team leader for the Grant Program Administration Systems Planning Bureau at the Iowa DOT. She's here to talk about trends, electronic vehicle planning in Iowa, also a new grant program, federal grant program that's being initiated in Iowa with some federal funding. I can give her. Deborah, you there?
I am here.
All right, welcome. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
If you want to do any more introduction, go ahead.
That's all right. Okay. I can just roll with it. I don't know. Right. I've been with the DOT for probably, 13 years or so. Before that, I was with the city of Fort Dodge. So my background is in local government, kind of how things work at the local level. So that comes in helpful sometimes.
Great. I got some slides. I'll go ahead and share those right now. I think it's the right one. There we go. Everyone able to see my screen?
Looks good.
All right. I'll let you kick it off, Deborah, and then I can add some commentary on some statistics and trends nationally and state of Iowa, and then we can kind of open up for discussion and any questions in general. All right.
Sounds good. All right. So thanks everybody for joining here on a warm Thursday afternoon in the summer to talk about electric vehicle infrastructure. Go ahead with next slide, Taylor, please. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to give you just a real brief overview of electric vehicle technology, just so everybody's got a baseline. Spoiler alert, I'm probably going to read my slides for those just to make sure I get the details right. A little bit on EV trends, and the meat of the presentation today is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is a new program that was part of the IIJA Federal Transportation Authorization that went through in 2021. Also our EV deployment plan that we did as a state last year, and kind of where we're at with implementation of that. Next slide. Okay, first, so EV technology, and not much on this slide. Go ahead with the next one. Okay, so that everybody's kind of got a baseline of what all these different types of electric vehicles are. Everybody doesn't, if you don't really own one, you may not really know all the details. So there's varying types of EVs on the market, and it is constantly changing, new models coming up. There's the hybrid electric, starting on the left. Those vehicles have onboard batteries that charge while the vehicle brakes during normal operation. Those will never get plugged in. The battery helps to increase the vehicle mileage. So those types of vehicles are not the type of vehicles we're looking to assist with our program. There's also a plug-in hybrid. Those have an onboard battery that charges using a plug-in, but the battery is small and range varies by the manufacturer. So typically these vehicles range from 20 to 50 miles on a full battery, and are typically good for moving around town or short distances to commute. Farther on the right, there are the fuel cell EVs that are still developing in technology. They don't plug in or produce emissions, so we're also not focused on assisting those. What we're really going to be focused on is the BEVs there on the right in the middle. Those are the battery electric vehicles, so that's all of the charging and propulsion is done using the electricity and electric engine. Most manufacturers are shooting for about 300 miles per battery charge, and these are the types of vehicles that will most likely to be assisted by the infrastructure we'll be putting in. Next slide. So there's 3 different levels of EV chargers currently. The level 1 is a typical residential outlet. That charges very slowly, best for overnight. You get 2 to 5 miles per charging hour for those. The level 2 chargers are faster. They can provide between 10 and 20 miles of range per hour of charging. And those are good for short range needs. Those are typically the ones that you're going to see like at your local grocery store or places where you might do a quick errand, hook your car up to charge for a bit while you're doing that, and then you leave and go about your business. The cost for usage is set by the host of the charging site for those, similar to like a convenience store setting the cost for the gasoline, for the fuel. The level 3 chargers are the fastest type of existing charging stations. And this is what this NEVI program is going to be aimed at addressing. They're also called fast chargers or direct current fast chargers or DC fast charge. There's a few different names for them, but they're all the same thing. These can provide nearly a full charge in around 30 minutes, and the charging site host sets the billing rate for those. And I don't know, I might steal your thunder a little bit, Taylor. I've got a few statistics in here, but I'll go over them real quick.
Go ahead and I'll just add to it.
Okay, so you can go to the next slide. So the main point here is that electric vehicle sales continue to grow in the US and growing in numbers and also in diversity. You're seeing some diversification in the types of models and makes that are out there. I'm seeing even like percentages of Tesla starting to go down a little bit. So it's getting a little bit broader nationally. Go on to the next slide. We've got some statistics from Iowa. We've got, as of December 2022, which is the last chunk of statistics I could get my hands on, almost 6,000 battery electric vehicles registered in the state. And that also continues to grow. Next slide. It might be kind of helpful to see where we're going. So we do project, although it is a very small amount today, compared to all the rest of the motor vehicles that are registered, we do expect the EVs on the road in Iowa to increase significantly. And we're projecting between 6.9% and 13.7% of EV fleet adoption by 2040. So that's a range of about 225,000 to 450,000 EVs owned by Iowans. Currently, it's about less than 1%. So that'll be a significant change within the next, 20 or so years. Next slide. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can kind of add a couple notes to that. So going back to the national trends, as Deborah mentioned, they're setting records every year, national sales. And 2022 was especially a good note. Increase in sales is up 55% nationally. And that's a year when we saw overall sales in cars decline due to supply chain issues, among other things. That's quite remarkable. And of those total sales, and that's what, the EVs are probably, EV charging stations are these all electric vehicles, which are the BEVs, battery electric vehicles. That's over like 70% of national sales. So plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, the PHEVs, are a smaller percentage, but still growing. And nationally, it's up to, I believe at the end of 2022, 3 million total stock. That's our total on the road. Not the most across the world. China only has, I believe, 50% of the total stock around the world, but we're growing. And we've got new policies, federal policies coming in play, through either the new Inflation Reduction Act and some other investment in battery manufacturing within the United States. So these things are going to probably increase and accelerate growth of electric vehicles nationally. And then Iowa, I just wanted to add, of this total number, how we rank state by state. As of 2020, at the end of 2021, we were about mid-level, 36 out of 51 actually. So right ahead of us is Washington, D.C., just to kind of give you a metric. But applying those national growth trends, it's an exponential growth curve. So as Deborah mentioned, it's going to go up quite fast, and you're going to have older vehicles coming out of that stock being replaced by electric vehicles. It's kind of all I had to add. I think we can talk about maybe some general state policies versus federal policies later on, but
Sure.
I let you go.
Yeah,
Continue
I
on.
mean, to kind of add to that a little bit in the direction of what you were talking there, Taylor, the interesting thing too about this, I mean, I've been working on this for a little over a year for the NEVI program anyway.
Mhm.
And, you know, there is constantly something every week, some kind of new news coming out of it, the market changing, the manufacturers changing, coalescing around different technologies. So the whole state of play for the electric vehicles is still constantly kind of shuffling a little bit. So it's still kind of a work in progress. So while we're trying to push out a program and put out EV chargers, there, you know, the the data and the information that we're getting is still changing. So it's a little bit
Rapidly.
shaky sands. It's interesting, to say the least. Yep.
All right. Well, let's talk about the actual NEVI program then.
All right. So some people on the call might be wondering, so, okay, electric vehicle infrastructure program, why is Iowa DOT involved in this? Why is this our thing? Why am I here? So aside from vehicle registrations, why I'm here is that this is pretty significant funding that was included in the federal transportation authorization bill that came out in 2021. But before that, backing up a few years, some of you may remember the Volkswagen settlement that went around in about 2016. I believe that was settled. So that was where Volkswagen was found to be putting defeat devices in their vehicles. And there was a settlement where they had to put money in a fund with a trust, and that was distributed to states to do different programs to affect emissions and kind of correct the damage that the Volkswagen vehicles might have done by having those kind of falsified emissions tests. Iowa received $21 million of that funding through the trust, and of that, about 15% could be used for zero emission vehicle supply equipment. So when that happened, Iowa DOT was lucky enough to become the lead agency for the state in administering that fund, and that landed on my plate. So we had a little bit of experience working on pushing out EV infrastructure through that Volkswagen settlement. Now that was a completely different animal because that was through a trust. It was not state funds. It was not federal funds. It did not have the strings that this new program will have. But that kind of got our feet wet a little bit. So we're actually lucky that we had that experience, so that having these funds pushed out along with our highway funds that we typically administer, we're at least familiar with what we're doing here. Next slide. So those not familiar with how federal transportation funding works, every about 2 to 6 years, there's a new federal highway funding authorization passed. Point of that, it may change the funding apportionments and the formulas, how the different states get the amount of funding that they get. It may alter or restructure existing programs that exist, or there may be new programs involved. They're kind of a grab bag every time we have one of these. It's a big ordeal, year-long process to figure out what's in it, what that means for us, what decisions we need to make of how we're going to spend our money in the state, and then move that through and actually implement it. So this last bill that we had from 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that included the $5 billion nationwide in formula funds for this program. And also it separately includes additional funds for discretionary grant program. Discretionary grant programs are programs that are administered directly through the federal government, so we don't really get involved in that. In February 2022, guidance was issued for the NEVI program initially. That was the 90-day guidance, so that was required in the bill that after 90 days, they would issue some kind of guidance to get things really moving. That was actually revised just 2 weeks ago with some all new stuff. So just like the technology changes, the guidance for this program keeps kind of shifting a little bit as we move forward. One thing to note that might be interesting to some folks on the call here, EV charging infrastructure throughout the bill was made an eligible activity for more than just the NEVI program through the Federal Aid Highway Program. It is also eligible for STBG, which is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, CMAQ, which is Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Funds. and the carbon reduction program. So there is some eligibility elsewhere in the federal aid highway program. Doesn't necessarily mean those funds would be easy to access for it. But the thing that I'm purposely noting here is that there is phone call. So the thing that I'm specifically noting is that in the guidance that came out with NEVI, it specifically says if any other funding program is used to fund an EV infrastructure site, charging site, they will also follow the minimum standards that are required for NEVI. So that throws out exactly how those projects would need to proceed, in case anyone was interested in doing that. One thing with this program is that it did require that all the states develop plans, EV deployment plans, prior to actually using any of the funds. So that was the very first task that we would need to do, is actually develop a plan with very specific requirements before we could move forward. Next slide, I think. So our approach, we have partnered with the Iowa Economic Development Authority and specifically the Iowa Energy Office in moving forward with this plan and implementation of the funding program. We also partner with IIJA during the Volkswagen settlement time. At that time, we partnered with probably a half a dozen state agencies in working together and working through how to push those funds out. Jointly here with the Iowa Economic Development Authority and Iowa DOT, we also hired HDR to be our consultant to help us push the plan out quickly. Like I mentioned, the guidance came out in February. The plans were actually due to be submitted by August 1st. So it was very tight turnaround by the time the guidance came out. You got it digested. What does it mean? There was a pretty tight timeline to be able to turn that around and get that developed. Next slide. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about the plan and what's in it, what the requirements were, and just a few tidbits about what's in it. Next slide. So the guidance that came out February 2022 had a lot of requirements for what needed to be in the plans. They actually also provided a template of what the plan needed to include, exactly how they wanted it to be laid out. That was used then as a guide for putting together the plan. The main requirements being to prioritize the EV charging stations along designated corridors, and I'll get more into what a designated corridor is later. Address needs for EV charging infrastructure in rural corridors and underserved and disadvantaged communities. So equity and making sure that funds are intentionally spread as far as you can away from certain areas where you would expect it to go. Potentially is one of the main points of this. This program also falls under the Justice 40 initiative, which is an executive branch initiative in the Biden administration to have a goal, at least, of seeing 40% of the benefits of programs being seen in disadvantaged communities. So equity is something that we need to address in our plan and in our program generally moving forward. I should also note, I don't think I mentioned that, the plan was required to be submitted that quick turnaround by August 1st in 2022 before we could move forward with any kind of pushing of funding out or a program. But it's also required to be updated every year of the life of the program. So we will be updating the plan each year for 5 years. So this guidance that I also mentioned just came out 2 weeks ago. Included in that is some revised guidance for the plan update that we need to do within the next month and a half. So that's even tighter time frame. So that will be updated every year. So every year we expect things to get tweaked a little bit. There will be slightly different guidance for us, and our conditions on the ground be a little bit different. But you'll expect to see a push out. Probably we think it's going to be timed the same every year, so probably about the August-September timeframe. Another requirement, provide long-term operation and maintenance. One of the goals of the program is to make sure that the sites can be as sustainable as possible. That's why these sites have a 5-year requirement for operation, which is an interesting requirement. So normally with most federal aid highway funds, we push something out, we construct it. Once it's constructed, we're done. In this program, once it's constructed, we also need to maintain a relationship with that site and the interest that we provided funds for 5 years to make sure that that continues in operation. Existing EV charging infrastructure programs and incentives. needed to be identified in the plans. We wanted to catalyze additional private investment in the way that we could. So there's some funding considerations in the plan, and that has a whole variety of other things: consumer protection, cybersecurity, domestic manufacturing, emergency evacuation planning. There's a whole lot of things that needed to be also considered in the plan as well. Next slide. So we did, even though we had that short time frame to turn this around from February to August, there was a pretty significant engagement element to developing the plan that HDR did help us with. We posted on the website, and there were 15,000 individuals at least that visited the website, and there was an online survey for kind of views about electric vehicles and charging in general. More than 1,600 people completed the online survey. We also had a lot of stakeholder outreach and small group meetings with the various utilities, other state agencies, private business interests that we knew would be interested in the program or was already in the EV charging market, so that we could better understand what the program might need to look like. Workforce considerations, speaking with workforce development, union individuals, so that we could understand what the labor market can support. And we also had to coordinate with neighboring states, because the point of this program is to have a nationwide network and make sure that, we don't, put out a corridor and it drops at the state border with Illinois. So next slide. Some goals that we included in the plan kind of mirror or take off from our state long-range plan, long-range transportation plan. So we want a fast charging system that supports regional and interstate travel, a local system that promotes equity and mobility, a charging network that provides a variety of options, transportation system that reduces emissions, a sustainable transportation and energy system that can adapt to economic, technological, and environmental changes, a charging network that supports long-term EV station success and maximizes economic benefits to consumers, and a growing network of chargers that fosters innovation. Next slide. So as with many plans, much of the plan sets the stage with going over existing conditions, various statistics, and existing sites. And like I mentioned before, there were a variety of topics that were required to be included in the plan. The bulk of the plan ended up kind of the purpose being to lead us down a path to consider the factors that are important to the program nationally in trying to work toward development of an implementation phase of how we would actually use the funds. So some of the plan focused on identifying gap areas, looking at what the existing sites were that we have out there in the state, where we know we will need to fill in those gaps, and kind of trying to balance some assessments of site suitability, which is where there are significant or acceptable amenities for users, because somebody doesn't want to charge their vehicle where there's no restroom or no shelter or can't get a drink or something like that. And the ability of three-phase power. I'll go over this a little bit later, but the power requirements for this program are a little bit more significant than some of the stations that are out there now. Balancing that with the site priorities. So that's the base location, make sure it's meeting the distance requirements that we need for the program, that we are actually filling in the gaps that we need to, and just overall to maximize federal funds and make sure we're doing this efficiently. Next slide. So the program guidance, and then there are later, maybe 4 or 5 months ago or so, they came out with even more detailed minimum standards. It's all very detailed and very extensive. So I will not go into all of the, down into the weeds on everything here today, but go ahead with the next slide, Taylor. We'll start with the funding of the program. So you can see there, IIJA was a 5-year bill. So over the 5 years, we're expecting to receive just over $51 million in program funds. The program's 80% federal participation, 20% minimum non-federal match. So putting those together, we're expecting these funds to put a minimum investment into the EV charging infrastructure of just over $64 million. Likely, it may be even more than that, just based on how some projects, maybe they don't get 80% funded and you end up spreading those funds a little bit further. This still remains a small program in the overall umbrella of the Federal Aid Highway Program, but it's pretty significant for what we're doing here. We have not been able to allocate any funds yet. Obviously, we needed to get that plan done last year and then move towards implementation. There's been a lot of twists and turns on that. I'll talk a little bit about here later. But as you can see here, we're already wrapping up, or close to wrapping up, the second fiscal year in the funding stream. So it will be over here pretty soon before we really get started, it seems. So for clarity, I did also want to mention here, I mentioned that some other federal aid programs can be used for EV charging infrastructure, and some of those may be some funds that are distributed to the MPOs and RPAs, the metropolitan planning organizations, and regional planning affiliations. Did want to mention these funds will not be distributed to the MPOs and RPAs for redistribution to local applications. These funds will entirely be distributed and awarded by Iowa DOT. Next slide. So when I mentioned designated corridors previously, what that really means is our alternative fuel corridors. So Iowa has some designated alternative fuel corridors for electric vehicle infrastructure. It's I-80, I-35, I-29, and I-380. The alternative fuel corridors, it's been a program that's been around, I don't know, maybe 5 years now. I think they're on their 7th cycle or so of submissions for corridors to be designated. But the purpose of that is just to improve mobility of alternative fuel vehicles nationwide. The intent being the states would adopt these corridors and indicate their intention to build out. This is the EV corridor, but it can also be other types of alternative fuels. They have different corridors for different types. So these are alternative fuel corridors in Iowa currently, and these would be the priority areas where the NEVI funds would be pushed out on. Next slide. So the NEVI requirements for charging stations. There are distance requirements. So the program wants to see a charging station at least every 50 miles, no more than 50 miles distant from each other, and wants to see it at least or less than a mile off of the alternative fuel corridor. So the intention being, we want to make sure that these stations are convenient for travelers to find and charge, and to eliminate that range anxiety that owners have sometimes when they're running their electric vehicle. There needs to be at least 4 150 kilowatt DC fast charging ports at each station. So I know, if you go out, sometimes you'll see 2. These will need to be 4, and they will need to be 150 kilowatts. A lot of the stations that you'll see out today are actually 50 kilowatts. So this is a much more significant power requirement. And then the other thing that is important to note is that we will need to build out, and I say build out in quotes, the alternative fuel corridors before we can be allowed to use the funds off of those corridors. I'm using that in quotes, in air quotes, because we don't really know what built out means yet. There was a little bit more information in the guidance that came out 2 weeks ago, but we still don't have a good definition of what that means. Is that constructed in operation? Is that the 5 years complete? Not really sure. So we will have additional information coming on that, I'm sure, as we get further along. One thing to note, I mentioned the Volkswagen settlement program a little bit before, that we did provide funding for electric vehicle charging. Those, if I look back at those, most of those were those 50 kilowatt ports instead of the 150 kilowatt ports. Those project costs were typically in the $300,000 range. These sites, because of the higher power requirement primarily, we're seeing estimates probably of up to $1 million per site, plus the operating costs over the 5 years. So we could have total eligible costs. Whether or not we end up making all of those eligible for Iowa's program or not is yet to be determined, but we could see eligible project costs for per site of upwards of $1.6 million. So that's a real significant difference just based on the requirements of these sites. And that will make a difference in how many we'll actually be able to push out with the funding. Another real unique aspect of the NEVI program is that there is a requirement that electricians that actually install these sites will be electric vehicle training program trained electricians. And just, for fun, to let you know, there's 161 trained electricians currently in Iowa. There's 6,100 non-trained certified electricians. So there's maybe 10% of electricians out there, or no, that's much less than that. Very few electricians out there that are actually trained and could meet the requirements to work on one of these sites. So we are trying to get the word out on that program to make sure that we get electricians trained. Next slide. So this is a map that is in the plan, just letting you see kind of where the existing stations were. Like I mentioned, we've got a few on there that show existing stations of level 3 fast charging. We now are not sure if those are going to count for our full build out or not. So that's a little bit different. I just wanted to mention too a few of the odd things that we're having with this program. The difficult thing is trying to cram highway funding into a non-highway funding purpose. So federal aid highway programs need to be compliant with Title 23 of U.S. Code, which has very specific rules in place for basically heavy highway construction, competitive bidding, all of that. And industry and U.S. Department of Energy comes to this program from the technology and the market side, but in the end, we're still having to have rules for this program that's like building a bridge. So there's a little bit of translation and trying to understand what things mean and how to translate the rules and requirements of normal highway construction to this program that is making things a little bit difficult, to say the least. Trying to figure out how contracting is going to work is one of the most significant ones we're still working with. So we're still working through a lot of questions ourselves. If you look nationally, there have not been a ton of states that have pushed out their funding programs yet. There have been probably a handful that have actually pushed them out. A lot of states are kind of sitting back and waiting and watching, seeing what lessons can be learned. And then, on top of all of that, we're one of those, but then also, we keep getting some different guidance that makes the program a little bit more difficult too, to just make sure that we're figuring it out correctly. Next slide. And I guess you can skip to the next one too, Taylor. So this is our original schedule. We started kind of in earnest to work towards implementation at the first of the year, and with the intention of being able to push something out midsummer or so. We quickly kind of ended up pushing that to a September target, or an August target. And now we're not sure where we're going to be for that now again. So on there, you're going to see it says summer 2023. We're kind of tentatively looking at early fall 2023. Could that push further? Possibly. Like I said, we still have a lot of things to work out. We're still working really closely with our Federal Highway Iowa Division Office, Legal Counsel, HDR, IIJA, and trying to work through a few big topics still. Uncertainty with this program as well. Once we push things out, we're not entirely sure how the funding flow is going to go with what projects receive funding. As everybody knows, supply chain is still an issue, and that's particularly an issue for, like I mentioned, these projects are going to require increased power supply and 3-phase power. So there will likely need to be utility upgrades. They'll have to go along with the sites themselves. So there could be, I know that transformers are something that are kind of difficult for utilities to get their hands on, in addition to components of charging infrastructure itself, which is also in the process of transitioning to a domestic supply versus non-domestic supply. Part of the requirements of this program is eventually they will have to comply with being domestically sourced. So we still have a lot of stuff to work on. We're not entirely sure what the timing is going to be for this first cycle. I imagine future cycles will be tweaked, but will we ever be able to get off of those alternative fuels corridors to provide funding for the level 2 chargers that are technically eligible activities in communities or that kind of thing? I can't tell you yet. So it's kind of still up in the air a little bit. You can go to the next slide, Taylor. So we do have a website. You can feel free to sign up there. I believe that there is a place to sign up there to receive updates. You can feel free to contact me if you have any questions. That is not my email address, but you can contact me at my name at iowadot.us. One thing I think also that would be helpful for this audience that we're even working through as a group here as we figure out implementation, take a look at what your development processes are. Would these trigger a site plan? Are your codes, are your code enforcers, your building trades, and your permits, that kind of thing? Is everything up to date and ready to go? Have you had any of these in your communities? There's not a ton of these out there, so it is still something that will be kind of one-off things initially for a lot of communities. So that's something to start looking into. And with that, that's all I have prepared. Happy to take questions, or I know Taylor, you've got some questions probably too.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. Yeah, we can open up to any questions or topics to revisit. Whoever likes to want to jump in. I guess I had a question on the state policies right now. National, this is a federal program, and can you kind of expand into, is every state, this is going to be competitive obviously at the state level, but every state is participating in this program?
Right. So yep. So this is what we call a formula program through the Federal Aid Highway Program. So what that is, it's one of the umbrella programs that there is a formula for how the funds are being distributed to the states. So all the states have funds available to them. To my knowledge, all of the states are moving forward with this in some form or fashion. No one is saying no to this. They're all buying into wanting, reading the writing on the wall. This is the future, and it's to their advantage to start building out a network.
Okay, yeah. I think that's what anecdotally I'm seeing in Eastern Iowa in the Quad City region. That politics aside or anything, where everyone's jumping on board and seeing the trends, and they're very convincing now. And we've seen some implementation at the local level through all privately funded or utility funded through Mid-American. So we have some level 3 near the interstate that would probably, I don't know if they're 150 kilowatt or 150 or 50, but they're near the I-80. So it's kind of interesting just in the last year alone. So.
Right. And as you have the vehicle manufacturers moving more and more in this direction, you also have the related industries like the fuel distributors seeing where this is going. They're very interested in this program. Whether or not this is actually going to be profitable business for different locations is a different thing. But, at some point, this will be a significant market to be in.
And then did you touch on, I guess, so these would be the ownership model for this. These would have to be owned by the applicant, basically, in this case, and that at least through the life of how does that work for the grant?
Yeah, and that honestly, that's one of the things that we are still working through. Simply because the Title 23 requirements and the related regulations that go along with that, like I mentioned, the contracting and what is meeting what definition is a little bit difficult. So most likely we are going to see private entities, whether that is a private owner of a site or a private operator, will probably be an applicant to this program. They may or may not have a site identified already, but we will probably require at least a site host agreement. Some of these details didn't include in my presentation. They're still a little squishy right now until we nail down exactly legally where we are on what the Title 23 allows us to do and how that's consistent with Iowa code. So that's kind of where we're at right now, but most likely these will be private entities that will be receiving funds, whether that's the operator like a charge point or the different charging companies that may come in and want to tap into funds and then go find a site, or it's going to be probably somebody that owns land and wants to develop the site themselves.
Okay. I think I see Daniel has his hand raised.
Yeah, I had a quick question. I know that there's a requirement that NEVI funds be spent on a charging station that's non-proprietary, that is, that's open to all EVs. However, with the recent announcement that both Ford and GM are adopting the Tesla charging system, do you see that shifting at all? Do you foresee NEVI funded stations needing to have both the CCS connector and the Tesla connector, or have we really not gotten that far yet?
Right. So the requirement currently is the CCS connector. We have also been asking that question. However, what we're hearing is that they may not be changing that requirement. But you never know, or maybe it would be changed in a future year for future updates of the guidance. It's unclear. But for now, Tesla is still not part of the program.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Anyone else with any questions? It's like Joe from Johnson County.
Yeah, I've got a question about when funds start to sort of go out the door. Do you have an idea of a scoring matrix or a rubric that'd be used to evaluate site locations, or is it just first applications in the door until you hit your cap for that funding cycle?
We're still working through that. Some of that will depend on whether we rely on our gap analysis and seek applications to specifically fill certain gaps, or if we're going to allow applications statewide to more compete against each other. So we are still looking at that and haven't completely settled on that yet. But yes, that'll be part of the rollout when we do launch. Is there will be a scoring rubric of some kind, yes.
Okay. Anyone else with any questions? I don't have any much more. This is just the first year, and hasn't been rolled out yet. So there'll be a lot to watch in the coming months and a year from now to see how the first year goes. It's definitely gonna, like you were mentioning in the beginning of the presentation, watching the news, there's something new every day, evolving, changing with Ford announcing their Tesla adapter. It's just changing all the time. So our local elected officials are very interested in it as well. They're always asking planning staff, and we're asking MPOs. So we're always going around asking each other. So this is helpful to kind of get everyone discussing it at once. I guess let's call for questions. Otherwise.
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Go ahead.
This is coming from a place of ignorance too, because I just heard about it yesterday. So, you know any details about the proposed tax on electric charging stations in commercial properties, or is there anything about that you can talk about and give us information as to how that might work?
I personally cannot. I know of it. I know the details were still being worked out. If I'm remembering correctly, Department of Revenue, I think, is taking the lead on that. I know there's discussion amongst state agencies about how to implement that. Like when you go to you go to the gas station and you fill up your gas-powered vehicle, you always have that sticker about weights and measures on the pump. So I know that there's been a question about that and whether or not weights and measures need to get involved and make sure everything is measured correctly and consistently. So I think that's something that's still being worked through on the details of that.
Do we have any timeline on those details?
I do not, but I can find out for you if you'd like, if you're curious.
That's fine. I'm sure that we'll hear about it when we need to.
Yeah, everybody likes to hear about when new taxes roll out.
And related to that, there's, I believe, July 1st of this year, there'd be new registration fees related to EV vehicles from a previous bill. So they'll be increasing the similar vehicle. I think it's, I don't know if it's 50% or 100. It's around double, I think, actually. So I guess it's kind of a mixed bag of policies. You're looking at the federal and state level, kind of, but. And that relates to also there's the sales tax bill,
Right.
But interesting nonetheless. Anything else from the participants?
I got one more quick NEVI question.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm curious if NEVI funds could be used to lease EVSE equipment, or does it have to be used on purchasing that equipment?
That's a good question. I'm not recalling seeing anything about leasing, so I want to say that it must be purchased, but I'm not going to tell you I'm 100% sure on that right now. But I believe it's purchased. That would be my guess.
All right, thanks.
All right. More questions for Deborah? I'm not seeing any, so I want to thank you, Deborah, for sharing this today and with all the discussion and answering the questions. This is very interesting stuff, and it will have, being a direct application to counties and municipalities, it's going to kind of lean less on the NPOs and RPAs, and we'll have to keep an eye on it at the municipal level. So, and it's the general topic of EVs, always changing, adapting. Great topic to talk about. Thank you, and I guess that's all for today. And thanks for the session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.